Welcome to the debate. Today we're grappling with an issue that sits, well, squarely at the collision point of microbiology, philosophy of language, and even critical theory. We're looking at the really unnerving case of the bacterium Xenobacillus glossophagii, or X-glossophagii, and the intense, unintelligible speaking pattern it induces in its hosts, glossolalia. And the core question we're wrestling with is profound. Does this linguistic disruption, this glossolalia, fundamentally represent a breakdown, a catastrophic failure of human language norms? Or are we actually witnessing the emergence of something new? A complex, biologically co-authored language game, a new Lebensform, as the philosophers might say.
Right.
My position is that the glossolalia is a state of pathological linguistic corruption. It results in noise and non-communicative failure. It is, quite simply, the sound of language breaking.
And I see why you'd land there, but I just have to come at it from a different angle. While the host state is, clearly pathological, I don't think the linguistic result is merely corruption. I maintain that this phenomenon is best understood as radical semiogenesis, the emergence of a new set of rules for a new language game. The rules are, well, they're certainly alien, but the biological intervention itself creates this profound challenge to the idea that humans hold the sole copyright on creating meaning.
Okay, so let's start by defining the stakes. When I say failure, I mean a collapse of the system's foundational logic. Dr. Elizabeth Rode famously characterized the output as language contamination. This isn't just unusual speech, it's erosion. I mean, if we consider the philosophical legacy of, say, early Wittgenstein, particularly his argument in the Tractatus, language functions because it possesses a logical structure that lets it picture reality. X.glossophagii seems to destroy that logical form completely. The utterances produced, they're not merely non-standard, they're systemically unintelligible. The infection forces the individual into a state that's analogous to the philosophical critique of a private language. Since the host cannot share a consistent, verifiable framework of meaning with any observer, human or otherwise, the foundation of language, shared understanding, is just extinguished. We're left with a semiotic disconnect, a symbolic collapse. That isn't genesis, it's a regression to a pre-linguistic void.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the failure to meet a human standard of shared meaning automatically equates to total linguistic failure. You're referencing a highly restrictive definition of language there, one that's rooted in that idea of mapping reality.
Well, it's a foundational one.
Sure, but if we shift to the later Wittgenstein, the rules change entirely. Meaning is defined by its use within a context, the particular game it belongs to, and that game is embedded in a form of life, the Lebensform. The bacterial intervention doesn't just disrupt the host, it radically alters the host's entire physiological and, perhaps, conceptual form of life. It creates a new context, and thus a new specific language game. Dr. Hugo Mueller, analyzing this phenomenon, noted precisely that. He said it reflects a linguistic collapse reflecting the collapse of rules and the creation of a new linguistic structure. The bacterium is effectively an active biological co-author, a semiotic agent, that imposes new, irregular rules. We have to embrace a xenopoetical perspective here. The glossolalia acquires a unique, biologically determined meaning. We might not speak the language, but that doesn't mean the language doesn't exist.
Okay, but that brings us to the core sticking point immediately, the stability and the verifiability of these so-called new rules. If meaning is determined by use within a rule-governed practice, those rules have to be consistent, and critically, they must be subject to intersubjective verification. I'm thinking here of Saul Kripke's interpretation of Wittgenstein's rule-following paradox. The central insight there is that if a rule exists only for me, and only my private feeling dictates whether I follow it correctly, then I have no grounds to judge whether I'm correct or incorrect. There's no linguistic witness.
Right.
So the bacterial interference, by isolating the subject into a linguistic reality shaped entirely by a specialized pathological biochemical state, a state influenced by, as Dr. Hayes documented, the pathogen's interaction with neurotransmitters, that constitutes a fundamental collapse of intersubjective meaning.
If the consistency of the utterance relies purely on the internal state of a single compromised nervous system, how can we assert that any verifiable rule is being followed? It might exhibit patterns, sure, but a pattern is not necessarily rule following in the philosophical sense. Without a communal witness, we are left with the philosophically incomprehensible private language, not an emergent system.
That's a compelling argument based on the necessity of the linguistic witness. But if you consider that the phenomenon just demonstrates the inherent contingency of linguistic stability itself, why must the witness be human? Wittgenstein showed us that language rules are not fixed, inherent logical structures. They are conventions established through human agreement. Glossophagy shows us those conventions are, they're fragile and subject to biological variation. The consistency you demand is present, it's just that the communal verification has been radically redefined. The rules are now biochemically agreed upon by the singular, unique host-pathogen interaction. The rule-following behavior is systematic, it's a game with rules, but the agreement that constitutes the rule is molecular, not sociological. It simply demands that we broaden our definition of community to include the non-human.
But if we look at the clinical reality, this systematic practice is destructive and it's involuntary. You're asking us to view a process characterized by decay and forced utterance as linguistic emergence. That seems like an ethical stretch, if not a conceptual one. The source material describes the body as a semiotic host organism undergoing what was termed necrotic transcription, a literal deterioration of the physical capacity to host the symbolic order. This is not a shift to a post-human language, it's the physical deterioration of the symbolic capacity itself. The output is unwilled, fragmented utterances driven entirely by molecular compulsion. When Dr. Hayes mapped the pathogen's interaction with neurotransmitter systems, the forced nature of the utterance was undeniable. Where is the conscious agency or intentionality required, even for a strange new language game?
Agency is a red herring if we discard the anthropocentric need for human consciousness to be the sole source of meaning. The pathology you cite is ironically the very mechanism of emergence, which you can call a semiotic ecological shift. If language is defined by flexible use within a Lebensform, then the unpredictable non-standard utterance patterns are merely a truthful reflection of a radically altered biological context. The chaos you perceive is the limit of our traditional categorization, not the failure of the system itself. The bacterium isn't just hijacking the machinery, it's reprogramming the input, establishing a new system where the biological dialogue dictates the rules. We have to reconceptualize the Lebensform as a fundamentally biological concept. The involuntary nature simply proves the authority of the biological imperative over the human will.
I think that framework, viewing the pathology as a site of creation, becomes particularly problematic when we step away from Wittgenstein and apply the tools of critical theory, specifically Žižek's framework of the symbolic order. If we look at the pathogen's function, glossophagii acts purely as a destructive master-signifier. It enters the symbolic realm of the host, and it imposes chaos, fundamentally degrading the host's capacity for coherent language. And this collapse of the symbolic order isn't theoretical. It's visible in the accompanying physical deterioration, the body described as a pathological diagram, a system failing physically as it fails linguistically. This trauma, in the Žižekian sense, doesn't produce an authentic new language. It produces only symptoms of corruption. It's the sound of the system violently failing, not the quiet construction of a successor.
I disagree that the effect is purely one of degradation, though, even when viewed through that critical lens. While the pathogen certainly shatters the existing symbolic order, the law of human communication, that very breakdown allows for what Žižek calls a radical over-identification with the collapse. The negation is so profound that it inherently creates the potential for a symbolic reemergence, albeit one that is fundamentally alien. And the key piece of evidence that suggests creation, rather than mere symptomology, is the structural analysis of the glossolalic output. Researchers have shown that this language follows a discernible syntactic and morphological logic, just one that's utterly unfamiliar to any human linguistic family tree. This means the bacterium isn't just erasing the old symbols. It is functioning as a constructive semiotic agent that reconstitutes rule-following behavior at a molecular level. It establishes a new, non-human linguistic authority.
But the difference between a pathology and an emergent language often hinges on intent and control. The glossolalia isn't the patient expressing themselves. It's the bacterium expressing itself through the patient. The human subject is simply the vehicle for molecular-level coercion. If the output is entirely dictated by biochemical state, if the utterance is merely the predictable byproduct of a fungal neurotransmitter interaction, then what we have is sophisticated biological noise. We don't have a communication system. You're arguing that the sheer complexity of the noise elevates it to the status of language, but complexity alone doesn't grant semantic value or intersubjective meaning.
And that just returns us to our original philosophical divergence. You require human semantic intent. I argue that the semantic field is broader than human intention. If we view language as a practice, and this practice is systematically organized by the co-presence of the pathogen in the host nervous system, then we have a function, we have use. And, as Mueller pointed out, there is structure, a discernible grammar. The fact that this grammar is utterly non-human is precisely why it is so valuable for xenopolemology. It forces us to acknowledge that rule-following behavior can be dictated by biological processes, challenging the very notion that consciousness holds the key to linguistic authority. The language exists. We simply lack the cipher.
But the lack of the cipher is the failure, though. Ultimately, the evidence points back to a pathology of the symbolic. The infected subject is isolated. The utterances are involuntary. The communication fails to bridge the gap to any recognizable community, human or otherwise. The glossophagii case confirms the deepest human-centric fear, the loss of linguistic control, where language divorced from rational human intention descends into unintelligible symptomatic noise. The inability to share meaning, whether human or hybrid, means the failure. The glossolalia is the sound of that void opening up.
And yet, what you term a void, I view as a radical opening. The glossophagii case is crucial for understanding the plasticity and profound contingency of language and meaning itself. It highlights that the limits of our world, which Wittgenstein taught us are defined by language, are porous and fundamentally contingent on biological, non-human factors. The complexity of the output suggests not failure, but a form of functional life language that defines a new, if transient, microbial human hybrid existence. We must push toward a xenopoetics perspective, where biological processes are integral to semiotics, even when those processes are destructive to the human symbolic order.
We're left, then, with the essential philosophical tension. Are we imposing the structure of language onto what is simply the trauma of molecular decay, desperately seeking meaning in the noise?
And we must ask if we are imposing the label of pathology onto a structured, functional, systematic process that simply operates beyond the bounds of our current linguistic categorization. The necessity of viewing language not just as a cultural construct, but as a dynamic biological process open to non-human co-authorship remains the defining lesson of this unsettling case. There is clearly much more to explore within this material.